Hey everyone, this is Chef, and yesterday I watched Cal and Roy stream the June 27th balance patch preview so that you don't have to. The theme for these changes is around boons and cooldowns. We're seeing a number of changes to the boons that different professions are able to provide to allies or remove from enemies. We're also going to see cooldown reduction traits reworked, and most cooldown reductions that currently come from traits are getting folded into the skills themselves. This video is broken up into chapters for each profession, and I invite you to use the timestamps in the description to navigate to the particular profession that you're interested in. We'll also talk about some of the overall philosophy for this patch at the end of the video, so if you're interested in that, feel free to stick around. And finally, before we get started, I usually don't do patch preview videos. I like to wait until the actual patch is out, so that there's not too much speculation, and we stick to what's actually changed. So this video is a bit of an experiment. If you like this video, and you want to see more like it, consider leaving a like, a comment, and subscribing to the channel. I use that information to decide if I should make these kinds of videos or not going forwards. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get started. One of ArenaNet's initiatives with this patch is to do away with traits that reduce the cooldown of your skills. For support Firebrand, Stand Your Ground now has a 24-second cooldown by itself, so all that Pure of Voice will do now is convert conditions when you shout. In this tier of traits, some groups were already using Force of Will for additional healing, and I think it will now be the consensus choice for support Firebrand going forward. As a result, you should see a pretty decent uptick in the healing ability of support Firebrand. Weighty Terms also gets a bit of a change here, refunding you an additional page when you use the last charge of one of your rare mantras, but this is generally something you don't want to do in World vs. World unless it's a truly dire situation, so it's unlikely to make much of a difference overall. Lastly, Master of Consecrations is also getting changed, but this trait choice was already pretty underwhelming, as was everything else in the column, so it's unlikely to change too much overall in terms of builds. I think it's possible that some people might decide to drop Virtues entirely, but I'd be a little surprised. Meanwhile, for Dragon Hunter, your Adept trait Piercing Light now only slows enemies struck by traps, as your trap cooldowns have been reduced across the board. In this trait column, Soaring Devastation now looks a lot more appealing to give you Resolve Virtue Leap, a 3-second immobilization. But I don't spend a lot of time on Dragon Hunter, and I don't know for sure if that's a change that people are going to be making or not. Moving on to Revenant, both Vindicator and Renegade are going to be receiving some pretty significant changes. Vindicator's receiving small reductions to the amount of healing and condition cleanse that it has access to, and Tree Song in particular will now only clear 3 conditions, down from 5. Support Vindicator relies on condition clears to enable a number of different profession mechanics related to its vigor generation and its ability to dodge, so this could have some knock-on effects for the rest of the build, though I don't think any of these changes are impactful enough to change the meta overall. Renegade, on the other hand, is receiving a pretty serious nerf to its ability to remove boons via Banish Enchantment, which now has a 5-second cooldown in World vs. World. Renegade's niche as a boon removal class in World vs. World was its ability to consistently remove boons on and around a single target, as you could use Banish Enchantment at any time as long as you had the energy to do so. I think this change is likely going to obsolete Renegade in high-level fights such as GVGs entirely, but it wasn't that common to see it in a typical squad in open world vs. World in the first place, so it's not going to be a huge change for that meta overall, and I'm also not the most experienced GVGer, so who knows how that meta is going to shake out either. Beginning with Berserker for Warriors, let's talk about Arc Divider. Currently, it's an AoE cleave attack that strikes enemies 3 times while you're in Berserk and wielding a greatsword. In the patch, this is being reduced down to a single strike, and to compensate, the channel time is also being reduced. Initially, this looks like a nerf, it's less strikes, but the power coefficient isn't changing at all. This means that instead of having Arc Divider's damage distributed across almost 2 seconds and 3 separate strikes, it's now all focused into one single big strike. So while this change might result in slightly lower damage overall, Arc Divider is going to have a much more potent damage spike, which is what matters for damage classes in World vs. World. And while I don't think this change is very fun, because seeing lots of big numbers pop up around you for your arc divider is just fun. I think this may end up being a slight buff, or at the very least, not much of a change overall. All that said, don't be too surprised if people take this opportunity to try out some different weapon sets on Berserker, like rifle or hammer. Meanwhile, Spellbreaker is losing a few sources of boon removal, in keeping with the overall theme of the patch. The duration of Winds of Disenchantment is being shortened, from 5 seconds down to 4 seconds, and the number of boons that Break Enchantment removes is being reduced down to 1 from a previous 2. Wastrel's Rune, which is your Dagger 4 ability, is getting a boon removal added, but support Spellbreaker's weapon kit in Hammer and Sword Warhorn is already really strong, so it's going to be difficult for Dagger to replace Warhorn in that weapon kit. It's not all bad news for Spellbreaker, however. Your Sword F1 skill, Flurry, can now be cast while moving, instead of rooting you in place for the duration of its cast, which is going to make it a lot easier to apply immobilizations while you're in your Sword Warhorn weapon kit. Unfortunately for hopeful support scrapper mains, while the profession is getting a few changes this patch, they're unlikely to return you to your pre-End of Dragon glory days. Fumigate is getting a slight cooldown buff, and Elixir Gun 5, Super Elixir, is getting better burst healing at the expense of lower overall healing. This elixir, and other elixirs that deal no damage, are also now unblockable, which means they are guaranteed to apply to allies through projectile destruction and projectile reflex. But Scrapper's main source of super speed, from Speed of Synergy, is having its duration reduced, and the profession's super speed output was one of its main draws as a support profession in World vs. World. Medkit Skill 1, Med Blaster, is also getting its per boon healing output capped, which will probably be a slight reduction to the profession's overall healing output, as Med Blaster was one of your most reliable sources of healing overall. On the other hand, if you're a damage scrapper or a damage hollowsmith, good news. Your profession wasn't mentioned at all, and in a set of balance changes that are primarily nerfs, that's a buff by exclusion, so congratulations. Thief is undoubtedly the profession with the least utility in group contexts right now for World vs. World, and while the motivations for some of these changes are well intentioned, I just don't think they're going to hit the mark. The main problem with Specter as a support right now lies in design. Virtually all support skills in Guild Wars 2, not even just in World vs. World, are either proximity based or field based, and they all prioritize party members first, followed by distance from the effect. Specter is neither of these, instead requiring an ally target to be most effective. So while many of these changes are intended to improve Specter's ability to support its allies, in practice and in execution, they're going to be difficult to pull off, as Specter's design philosophy relies on an outlier of a targeting mechanic among supports in the game. Now, is it impossible for Specter to be good? No, I don't think so, but it's a tall ask. And while the proposed changes do interesting things, they get tripped up by Specter's own weird targeting rules. For example, Specter's Grandmaster trait Shadow Step is being reworked in order to provide the benefits of your Shadow Shroud skills to any allies that are around your tethered target. Now that's good, except that almost all other support skills in the game, along with things like healing and boon application, give priority to people in your party. This is why most squads in World vs. World have a support firebrand and a healer in every party, to ensure an even distribution of boons, healing, and condition cleanse across the entire group. Specter's Shadow Step tether doesn't give you this level of control over who gets your support though. It's dependent on who's around your target, not who's around you, and that makes it quite a bit worse in comparison, because you can't really control who's getting those support skills outside of your single intended target. Speaking of medium armor classes that I don't play very much, let's also talk about Ranger. And this one's unfortunate, because Druid seems like it's getting some really substantial buffs to its support package. I just haven't played it, and I don't know a lot of people who have either that I can talk to about it, so I'm not going to. Sorry, it's on my list of things to do, but that's a long list, and I would rather own up front that I don't know what I'm talking about with Druid than try and pretend that I do. So maybe by the 27th I've got a bit more to say here, but there's not a lot going on right now. Now, Necromancer, on the other hand, I would say I'm very well versed in. It's been my main profession for the last several years, and I have a lot of mixed feelings on this one. Consistent with boon removal being reduced across the board, Necromancer is going to receive a series of nerfs to its ability to remove boons from enemies, with the cooldown on Devouring Darkness, your traded Scepter 3, being almost doubled from 10 seconds up to 18 seconds. The bigger change is that many of Scourge's skills no longer corrupt boons, instead simply removing them. Unholy Feast, your Axe 3, and Spiteful Spirit, your Spite Grand Master, will no longer corrupt boons, and while Ghastly Breach and Trail of Anguish do still fully corrupt boons, they only convert them into Torment. Additionally, the duration of Breach is being reduced to 3 seconds, down from 4, which leaves your F2 skill, when you trade it with Path of Corruption, as the only full boon corrupt that's still available to the profession. Now that said, this is a boon corrupt that still functions at 900 range, so that is a nice element, but the cooldown is also being increased by 50% if you trade it with Path of Corruption. Several of Scourge's talents are also being reworked, moved, or completely removed. Feed from Corruption, the Grandmaster Scourge trait which grants you any boons that you remove from an enemy, is being replaced entirely with Desert Empowerment, which causes your F1 to apply barrier to allies near it. This trait is also getting expanded and will grant Alacrity to any allies that you apply barrier to. Your heal skill, Sand Flare, is getting built-in barrier application rather than being tied to your adept trait, Abrasive Grit, and in its place, Abrasive Grit will now grant Might anytime you apply barrier from any source. So, a couple things that are interesting here. Desert Empowerment is moving to the Grandmaster tier, and your other two Scourge Grandmaster traits are not all that good, which means that Scourge in World vs. World will probably be able to apply Alacrity pretty much automatically. It's for doing things that you already should be doing, and the trait isn't really competing with anything else in that category. Meanwhile, we don't know what trait is going to replace the empty slot in the Master tier that Desert Empowerment is leaving, and the cooldown reduction from Sadistic Searing is getting removed and replaced with Burning Duration, which doesn't really sound that great. I'm also not really a fan of Sandstorm Shroud, so I'm looking forward to whatever trait ends up replacing Desert Empowerment in this tier, but we currently have no idea what that trait is going to be. We're just going to have to wait and see when the actual patch comes out. Now overall, this is definitely a nerf to Scourge's capacity to remove and corrupt boons, but I think it may actually be a buff to Scourge's profession overall, as it now feels a very interesting boon support role while maintaining pretty good damage profile and some amount of boon denial. That's a really flexible hybrid class, and I'm very excited to play with it and see what kind of build options are available. Going from a long summary to a short summary, not a lot is going to be changing for Elementalist in this patch. Those of you running Dagger Tempest are getting a new movement utility on Dagger 5, which is going to become a short-range leap instead of a channel. That seems fun. Those of you running Arcane are getting a little bit of a healing buff, but I do still think that Fire and Water have the edge in terms of overall group performance when you're running Support Tempest. And that's really about it. Not a whole lot else changing for World vs. World here for Elementalist. Rounding out our changes with Mesmer, and surprisingly, for a patch about boon control and boon removal, the profession with one of the highest overall boon strip outputs is pretty much untouched in that respect. There are some ranged engagement nerfs here on the other hand, with the range of Null Field going from 1200 down to 900, and the range of Temporal Curtain, your Focus 4 pull, going from 900 down to 600. If you stick around for the patch philosophy section after this, we're going to get into what that change might mean for the way that fights take place in World vs. World going forward. But the core of Chronomancer's ability to remove boons, by triple casting Null Field with Mimic and Continuum Split, or by using Shatter skills while in melee, is completely unchanged. In a set of patch notes where the other three boon removal professions took pretty substantial nerfs, this leaves Chronomancer in a very powerful spot as the consensus best boon removal profession in World vs. World. Some of Chronomancer's Alacrity and Quickness generation has also been slightly reworked, so that these effects are now tethered to summoning Phantasms off of your Focus 5, Phantasmal Warden, and Shield 4, Echo of Memory. Your Flow of Time minor trait which previously generated personal alacrity every time you shattered a clown, now grants party alacrity. So overall, that should be a slight increase to Chronomancer's ability to produce alacrity for your party. Virtuoso is also getting a small number of buffs here, but I don't think any of them are likely to improve the profession's current representation in the meta, especially alongside a Chronomancer build that has become significantly more powerful. So that should be all 9 classes covered. Overall, I think Chronomancer and Druid are pretty clear winners here. I think that Revenant and Warrior are a bit of losers, and everyone else is pretty much unchanged except for Scourge being a big question mark right now. We're not going to have a great answer on whether that's going to be a nerf or a buff until we have some specific numbers on the amount of alacrity that your barriers generate, as well as what the new Master Scourge trait is that's going to replace Desert Empowerment. And if you were only here for specific profession balance changes, that's all I've got for you. Feel free to head off. Enjoy the rest of your day, all that good outro stuff. For everyone else, I do want to talk briefly about how this patch might shift the overall landscape of the game mode. So if you'd like to stick around, let's go do that. Well, the stated goal of this patch is access to boons and removal of cooldown reductions. There's a couple sneaky changes in here that suggest a shift in the way I think ArenaNet wants fights to happen in World vs. World. Specifically, I think many of these changes are a nerf to ranged fight styles. You'll see people call this pirate ship meta. And there were a few times that Cal and Roy alluded to this in the stream that they did. One of the big enablers of pirate shipping is being able to strip boons and execute pulls at range. And moving null field into 900 instead of 1200 means that groups need to get quite a bit closer to one another to execute on that style of fighting. Now, I have a personal bias here because most of the groups I run with favor fights in melee, but I think this is a good change. I'm just worried about the execution of this idea overall. Let's start with Necromancers losing most of their sources of boon corruption. And I do get it, boon corruption is probably too strong. The reason that stability is so vital in World vs. World is because not being able to control your character is not a fun experience. And stability corrupting into fear, a condition that makes you lose control of your character, just compounds that issue. But boon corruption was one of the things that gave Necromancer, and Scourge in particular, its profession identity in World vs. World. When you thought about your profession options for boon control, who are you going to bring to make sure that your enemy doesn't have boons? The draw of using Scourge over something like Chronomancer or Spellbreaker is that it has a good damage profile and also applies a lot of condition pressure as it removes boons, which taxes an enemy's support players. Now that aspect of Scourge isn't totally gone, it does still convert boons into torment, but it is diminished, and it makes the choice of what to use for boon removal in a squad feel a bit more homogeneous as a result. And I get it, it's a hard spot to be in for a balanced team, to have to decide between profession identity on one hand, and a profession that fills a healthy role in the game mode on the other hand. You should pretty much every time make the choices that lead to a healthier game mode, because people tend to not play games that are horribly imbalanced, but very flavorful. In an ideal world, maybe corrupts would add a random damaging condition to avoid corrupts leading to that loss of character control so that you don't have to get rid of them entirely. But I'm not a game designer, so I don't know. It just makes me a bit sad, that's all. I think it's a homogenization of a class identity that was relatively unique in the game mode. Anyway, the knock-on effect from reducing that number of boon strips available is that it's going to become easier to fight in melee. I think this is mostly good. Melee is a more active style of play, and it makes for a faster-paced game mode overall. But the problem is that melee fights are much more numbers dependent than ranged fights are. The larger group often wins a melee fight, independent of player skill level or particular build choices, while the winner of a ranged fight is often the group that was more successful at coordinating their pulls and their ranged spike damage. But this wasn't always the case. In older versions of the game, smaller groups had tools to win outnumbered fights in melee. When Winds of Disenchantment prevented all boon application entirely, a smaller coordinated group could use that window to spike damage and swing the momentum of a fight in their favor. Or when Trail of Anguish had no target cap, a few Scourges in a well-defended choke point could generate an outsized amount of boon removal, giving an outnumbered force an opportunity to capitalize on a larger enemy's lack of boons. Both of those tools are now gone, as of previous balance patches, and as a result, smaller groups are finding it more difficult to win those lopsided engagements. I think this is unfortunate, because one of the times that World vs. World really shines is when a few skilled and coordinated players are able to win that pitched battle against a much larger but disorganized force. Boon removal and boon denial are extremely important tools for groups looking to win those melee engagements, so removing access to these skills makes it easier to win fights with a simple numbers advantage, rather than a skills advantage or a build advantage. Of course, the caveat is always that this was a patch preview, and none of these changes are live on the servers yet. All of these changes are subject to change, and there's still over 2 weeks to do some additional tuning if ArenaNet chooses to. Like I said, that's one of the reasons that I haven't done videos for patch previews in the past, because a lot of these changes could still be speculative and not actually make it to live servers. But I did enjoy taking a deep dive into these patch notes and exploring these potential changes, so I hope that you did as well if you stuck it out this long. Again, if you want me to do more patch preview coverage in the future, the only way that's going to happen is if this video does relatively well. So leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this. No hard feelings if it's not for you. These patch coverage videos are actually pretty annoying to make in terms of turnaround time. You can't exactly sit on them, you really want to get them out quickly after the notes come out. So I'd be totally fine with not doing them if people don't actually want to watch them. Anyway, I'll talk to you again in a few weeks when these changes go live, and we'll see what's different. But until then, I've been Chef, and enjoy the rest of your day.